Well, I'm going to start. I'm just going to start so that we can get going, and then we can. This happens in Washington too. We end up starting, and then people just jump in. Especially in our committee, as those who follow us in Washington, a lot of times Mr. Waxman will not be in committee on time, and of course we, with all deference to the ranking member, we make sure he gets a chance to weigh in on his opening statement. So let me start. The cycle of discovery, development, and delivery is what saves lives, and we want this cycle to work effectively and efficiently to eliminate the gaps between science and the regulatory process. To do so, we as legislators are undertaking a process to listen to experts and involve parties so together we can accelerate the pace of cures to keep America a leader in medical treatment and the gold standard for drug and device development. Since launching the 21st Century Cures Initiative earlier this year, and I was telling people, again, we've done 3 hearings like this, six hearings, those are the formal stuff, and 3 roundtable stuff, activities. The Energy and Commerce Committee has held 3 roundtables and 6 hearings. We have heard from many experts in the field of how we can collaboratively accelerate the discovery, development, and delivery of new treatments and cures. This bipartisan initiative, and I want to acknowledge and recognize my colleague. She's a classmate, which means we went to Washington the same year, Diana DeGette from Colorado, and she's our Democratic partner in this as the leader for her side. Your participation and positive engagement is critical to help us understand how we maintain our leadership role in biomedical innovation and personalized medicine. That's the exciting thing that I like, is this whole debate now and using the terminology of personalized medicine based upon, even though we look the same with the same 2 arms, 2 legs, hopefully toes and stuff, that personalized medicine is going to be very, very helpful, and we can get more specific to doing that. You're going to be next.
Thank you.
Your participation and positive engagement is critical to help us understand how we maintain our leadership. I want to again welcome all of our panelists and attendees to our 21st Century Cure Roundtable. I didn't know we had that many. I was told there's a couple in Florida also and around the country. We look forward to each of your unique views. And then after that, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Congressman Davis, to do an opening statement. Then we'll go around and do introductions, and then we'll let them do opening statements.
Great. Hey, thank you very, very much. Sorry I'm running behind. Welcome to the 13th District of Illinois.
Oh, really? 13th?
Yes. The 13th District of Illinois. Happy to have you. And it's good to see my good friend Steve and Tammy Rockford here. Did you get the ALS video? All right. Hey, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Shimkus. This is something that the Energy and Commerce Committee that he is serving on and has served on so well for so many years is making a push to talk about healthcare, to bring people together, to address many issues. And through this 21st Century Cures Initiative, we in Congress, we're taking a comprehensive look at the full arc of accelerating cures. And as somebody whose wife is a 15-year colon cancer survivor, I know, my family knows how important it is not just to talk about a diagnosis, not just to talk about a treatment, but to talk about cures. And that's why we're here today. A cure is anything from the discovery of clues in basic science to streamlining the drug and device development process to unleashing the power of digital medicine and social media at the treatment delivery phase. This work will be a collaborative effort, which brings us here today. I want to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time. I'm eager to hear from each of you around this table, those that I know and those that I don't know. And I want to know about the challenges that you're facing, as well as some of the innovative work that's going on right here in Illinois. I look forward to hearing each of your ideas, and also look forward to the discussion and the question and answer session about how we in Washington can make it better and work our ways together towards the cures. So thank you very much. Thanks for hosting.
Great. And thank you, Rodney. We're going to go, I'm going to call individuals by name. You've got about 3 minutes to talk about your general issue, but also give more of a background on who you are, what do you do? Because we got a lot of different groups here, from people who are in the private sector to the healthcare education system to patient advocates. And so if you would do that. So we're going to start with Dr. David Stewart, who's the Associate Dean for Community Health and Service and the Professor of Internal Medicine right here at the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine.
So I should take my 3-minute period now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sure. Thank
But,
you. Thank you, Congressman Shimkus and Congressman Davis. We appreciate the opportunity. It's an honor to be here. I am the Associate Dean for Community Health and Service here at the School of Medicine at SIU. I'm also a general internist, still practicing for 35 years, right down the street 2 blocks here if anybody has a need. From both of those perspectives, from the perspective in particular of the Office of Community Health and Service, we attend to the health and healthcare needs of the population in 66 counties in southern Illinois and central Illinois, 32,000 square miles, about 2.2 million people. A lot of these people are distributed into wide areas throughout the region, many smaller communities that continue to struggle or work hard to maintain high-quality healthcare services. And so the topic of today is very important because an important part of the solution for healthcare delivery in those communities deals with electronics and social media and communication technologies. In particular, I want to comment on telemedicine, which is a way that we can deliver care remotely and make sure that the best opportunities for expertise and to bring to bear the technological and discovery advances that we make can be distributed to everybody who deserves it, which means in the smallest town in the farthest reaches of central and southern Illinois. So, but there are burdens that keep us from being as efficient and effective as we can be in delivering telehealth. So one of those is reimbursement policy, and I think that work to be done to make sure that people who participate in this get reimbursed fairly for the services they provide, just as if they were seeing patients in person. It's a very important step. In addition, some other activities related to credentialing, related to common ability to serve across state lines when we have a territory that might be from one state to another, it could be very helpful. So that those considerations are critical when we're talking about distributing health care in the region. One other thing I want to mention is that we've taken to paying attention to the health of people in our region, and it's very helpful to have databases of patient information and population information that can inform us about the particular problems that affect people in various areas. So, for example, we at the medical school have collaborated with the Illinois State Cancer Registry and done some work to identify the differences in cancer experience in the different parts of the state. And what we find, for example, there are many facts that come from this, but one that's of particular importance, I think, is that in the southern rural regions of Illinois, a person who's diagnosed with cancer is 10% less likely to be diagnosed at an early curable stage than the people in the collar counties around Chicago. So those are people who've escaped cure by the time they're diagnosed. That's a disadvantage that people in southern Illinois have. And the only way we find that out is to have good patient information that crosses over all the counties, it's collected consistently, and it can be reported to us. The Cancer Registry is one of those kinds of resources, but there are many others that can be developed, and in particular with health information technology that's available now, the barriers to keeping large databases of patients or assembling them and then making them available to researchers and healthcare providers need to be addressed if we're going to have the best possible healthcare we can, in particular related to the 21st Century Cures effort that you're making.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. We're going to just go around the table in the process. So next, Ellen Wagner. And I would just say there's a lot of different patient advocates do a lot of fundraising and stuff. So Duchesne's does pour a pint in Washington, D.C., which I participate in annually. It's a pint of Guinness, and I never can get it right perfectly. I never win, but it's fun pouring it. So
I think that's Joel Wood's fundraiser, if
it
I'm not
is.
mistaken.
You're very
Joel's
good.
a fun guy. If Joel Wood invites you out to dinner, go. Joel's a lot of fun. Thank you, Congressman. Again, my name is Ellen Wagner, and I am on the board with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And I'm the mother of a 16-year-old. His name is Tim, and he has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy has been the leader in the fight to end Duchenne for over 20 years now. I want to say that PPMD and the larger Duchenne community are very grateful to Chairman Upton, Chairman Pitts, and the entire Energy and Commerce Committee for undertaking the 21st Century Cures. As Dr. Stewart just said, there's so much opportunity with technology. It's nice to see the government getting involved and taking advantage of it. Accelerating patient access to treatments, therapies, and cures is the top goal of our organization, and frankly to my family. Tim was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy at the age of 2. Duchenne is one of the many forms of muscular dystrophy and is a progressive disease leading to many tiny deaths, such as losing the ability to climb stairs, to walk, to lift one's arms, and to take care of oneself before taking the life of most boys in their 20s. My family and I watched Tim lose ambulation and now the ability to feed himself as he loses the use of his arms. And although a wheelchair is great help with ambulation, there's nothing that is a replacement for arm movement. Today, boys like Tim with Duchenne are living longer than before, on average into their late 20s. But as Dr. Stewart just mentioned, I'll add a little to this. We did a study with the CDC a few years ago, a parent project participated in, and there was a 7-year gap in life expectancy between the South and the Northeast. Life expectancy is only 20-something years, and there's 7 years difference. That's horrible. So, the rural communities of our country really suffer. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Our community is encouraged by the number of potential therapies that are in varying stages of development and evaluation. There's 3 right now that are in critical late-stage clinical trials, and we're hopeful by the end of this year, the first ever Duchenne drug applications will be submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. And we want the FDA to be ready to move as expeditiously as possible when this milestone occurs. One drug has conditional approval in Europe, and it's the first treatment with any kind of approval ever for this disease in the world. So we're really excited. PPMD has been leading the Duchenne community in a number of groundbreaking projects intended to do that. The projects include quantifying and presenting data to the FDA regarding risk and benefit preferences of our community so they can be factored into review decisions, and a groundbreaking effort to develop draft guidance to industry working to develop therapies for Duchenne. I'm happy to provide more details in the question and answer session if anybody has any. One of the things that we're really excited about is this week we drafted a draft guidance for the FDA looking specifically at drug development for Duchenne. And this week the FDA has added it to a docket and opened a 30-day comment period. So that's really exciting for us. That's a great move forward. So as you and the committee work to develop a 21st Century Cures legislative package, we offer the following recommendations. We hope the FDA Safety and Innovation Act creates more pathways to strengthen the patient voice and perspective on drug development issues. While a good start, we need to make sure FDA is listening and telling us how they are or are not taking the perspective into account by making critical decisions on product approvals. We also need the FDA to issue more and timely guidance to industry developing therapies, particularly in rare disease. For example, while there's much talk about patient perspective or patient-reported outcomes, the agency, being the FDA, needs to be clear as to what will and will not be accepted. We must reform the clinical trial process, particularly when dealing with studies in rare disease populations. My son has been enrolled in a trial that's going into its 10th year. The studies take too much time, they cost too much money, they require too many patients, and they cost us valuable time we don't have. With advancements in knowledge and technology, particularly in diseases like Duchenne, we can do much today to streamline the process. We also must consider new approval pathways, namely conditional approvals for drugs that have proven safe and demonstrate efficacy, yet still require larger confirmatory studies, particularly in conditions like Duchenne that lack any current disease-modifying treatments. Earlier access can mean the difference between life and death. And finally, I implore Congress to provide the National Institutes of Health with the resources it needs today and tomorrow to continue to fuel our research pipeline. If not for a strengthening of NIH's commitment to muscular dystrophy research through the MD Care Act in 2001, we would not have anywhere near the research breakthroughs and therapeutic pipeline that we have today. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to questions.
Thanks for coming. I want to make sure I also recognize Mr. Sarley, Jr. Not you. Chris is back there. Chris is his dad's also traveling with him in the back. But Chris is, as many of you know, he's my healthcare public policy guru. So anything that I fail to catch or respond to, go to make sure you talk to Chris because he's networked real well. He came out of Denny Hastert healthcare staff, so I was very fortunate to get him. Now we want to turn to Kirsten Axelson from Pfizer, and I'm going to make one point. In 2006, Kirsten was awarded the Pfizer Global Health Fellowship and worked in Ethiopia with the International Trachoma Initiative. So welcome, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here today and for being open to creating these forums where we can share ideas and work together to advance an environment for innovation. So my name is Kirsten Axelson, and my role at Pfizer is to examine actual and potential changes in healthcare policy and understand the implications for Pfizer and our ability to innovate to improve human health, which is our mission. I think all of us have a different perspective on how medicines have improved life, increased longevity, reduced deaths, particularly in areas like heart disease, cancer. We've seen tremendous improvements in survival over the last decades due to medicines. What is also unique about medicines is the built-in cost containment and also need to innovate in order to survive. Because of the patent, you have a relatively short amount of time to regain an investment on a medicine, and you have to continue to innovate in order to continue to survive as an industry. Drugs have also brought down costs, and in fact, they're the only part of the healthcare sector that is recognized by the Congressional Budget Office to reduce costs in other parts of healthcare by avoiding hospitalizations and other kinds of events that tend to be costly and also more sort of destructive to quality of life. And for example, right now there are 12 million people in the United States taking generic atorvastatin, which was known by the brand name Lipitor. Those people are taking a medicine for a very low price that is a result of a huge amount of investment. It was a medicine that was very commercially successful. So that medicine is now fueling the next generation of research in personalized medicines for cancer, in immunotherapies, in vaccines that will go on to continue to improve life. We think about a time 10, 20 years from now, there's going to be medicines for cancer that are available for very, for pennies a day in generic form, and that cycle of innovation will continue to go on. Now, like any business, Pfizer and other innovative pharmaceutical companies are affected by the business environment, and increased uncertainty in a business that's already very uncertain makes it a bigger challenge. And some of that increased uncertainty comes just from the science we're doing. We're innovating in harder conditions. The clinical trials are getting longer with the need to do more tests, recruit patients that are more difficult. And that's something that there are solutions. There's potential for more awareness around clinical and trial enrollment, but also for getting more certainty for how the product is going to be approved and regulated. There's more commitments on us to do post-marketing safety studies. We could use more certainty and more rapidity around getting to agreement there so that we can get medicines in the market, being studied, but also being used by patients at the same time. And then once a medicine is in the market, that's really just the start of it, because there's increasing reimbursement hurdles. And I know Dr. Stewart had mentioned reimbursement as well. When we look at the types of benefits that are in the new Affordable Care Act health insurance exchanges, while they're required to cover 70% of the cost on average in the premium, they cover 54% of the cost of the drugs. So we've set up a benefit where the incentive is on the patient to avoid the drug because they pay so much more for the upfront cost of the drug and end up going to the hospital, which is exactly the opposite of what we'd want in a preventive healthcare system. So thank you again for creating a forum where we can raise and discuss these kinds of ideas and ways that we could improve the healthcare system in the future.
Great, thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Steve Smith, who's 15 years experience in advocating for public policy changes to improve the clinical trials process. So the great thing about this sector, and it's also the challenging thing, is everybody's here because they really, it's a industry, or it's a service sector to care for people. And then when you get into something like this, there's always you always hear sad stories about people who are engaged because of losses. Mr. Smith had one, so he's dedicated his life now to this process. So thanks for coming.
No, thanks for having me. And for the 21st Century Cures process in general, I've attended a few of the meetings in Washington, D.C., and it's really great to see the different stakeholders working together so much more effectively now than they did 15 years ago. My name is Steve Smith, and I have a son with a rare progressive disease called mucopolysaccharidosis type 4A. It's called Morquio syndrome. And it's one of 7 diseases, actually 11 if you break it down genetically, which are biochemically related and have similar clinical trials issues. And I've been advocating for a long time around those issues, talking to stakeholders around the world. I first called the FDA in the year 2000 and took them a list of the 9 things I thought they were doing wrong and the way they communicated with biotechs in clinical trials and the 6 things we wanted them to do. And to my surprise, they agreed. They said, and they made some small changes regarding a few clinical trials. But and things have come a long way, but we still have big issues. The disease my son was diagnosed with at age 3 in 1990 still has no cure, and medicine that I believe was safe was available in the lab in the late 90s for him. And that medicine was approved in 2014, this year. As I've watched this disease progress, I've seen the slow churning clinical trials process and how inadequate it is, as I've watched some of the biochemically related diseases get their treatments approved, other MPS diseases and other lysosomal storage disorders. And I've also watched the common cause we have with rare cancers. I've lost my father to a rare cancer, best friend to a rare cancer this summer. My son lost a best friend to lymphoma recently. So the common cause we have together is, I think, makes 21st century cures very well placed. I've spent a lot of quality time with families that have 200 or so different rare disorders because of the advocacy groups that I very actively am involved with. One of them is the National MPS Society. I sit in their committee for federal legislation. MPS diseases, most of them are worse than my son's disease. My son is 3 feet tall. He's 27 years old. He's confined to a wheelchair now, but he didn't used to be. He's gone progressively deaf and a lot of other problems, but his intellect is intact. The other MPS diseases are not so lucky. Another umbrella advocacy group I belong to is the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. We exist solely to change the clinical trials process and have done a lot of research to figure out what exactly does need to be done and work directly with the FDA and with a lot of biostatisticians and pharmaceutical companies and so forth. So these are the points that these advocacy groups I work with agree on and which have been submitted in white papers to the 21st Century Cures through 2 different groups, and I've consolidated them here. These are our points. First of all, that the clinical trials process itself is broken and needs to be fixed. I think the stakeholders agree on that. We need the FDA to establish new standards for trials for small patient populations, and we need the FDA to energetically support these new standards and issue guidance for industry, something which they do not consistently do. The double-blind placebo standard that was created for reasons that are counterproductive to rare disease research, and they're causing much loss of life. The placebo standard used today is insensitive to particularly small patient populations and the heterogeneity of response. So that means when a small group in a clinical trial all respond positively to the drug, but they all respond differently, that doesn't count according to our current paradigms. And knowing that we will never have, if we continue along that line, enough treatments for rare diseases because numerically it will never figure. So we need new standards that are sensitive to small patient populations. We need more use of biomarkers for disease research, meaning not just clinical data that comes up in a clinical trial, how does the patient progress, how do they look, but biochemical markers. We're all familiar with Lipitor and the use of LDL cholesterol as a marker for potential heart disease. That's an accepted biomarker. There are many more biomarkers we could be using which aren't allowed because there isn't enough historic evidence for the FDA to be comfortable that it's safe. And that takes me to the point that Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy is a leader on in our community. We're very proud of what they've been doing. We need more of that, and I'm speaking of the risk versus benefit guidance that patient communities can give to the FDA, saying, since we have a progressive disease which is fatal or very serious, we need you to let us take more risk than you're letting us take. If we're going to die anyway, what are you protecting us from by requiring a lengthy double-blind placebo trial which will last years and years and years? We would like you to take our guidance and let us collect some data to show you at what level we will take it. And as a rare disease advocate, we'd like not to be have our voices marginalized. When we hear frequent comments, people will say, that can never be allowed because millions would be hurt if we let that kind of standard slip through. And in no rare disease are we ever talking about millions of people. We're talking about an FDA which has a much more targeted kind of approach now FDASIA has helped that. PDUFA 5 has helped that. And what the FDA needs to be able to focus targeted on these clinical trials and say, okay, this one should take more risk, let them have it, is they need a budget. And they need to be able to staff up and get experts in various different biochemical diseases. Without budget, the FDA will be incapable of responding to the mandates they've now been given under PDUFA 5. NIH similarly needs a budget. And finally, we need to reduce liability fears. Liability fears in the United States are holding back health care from using wireless technology and having the medical home. They're holding back clinical trials that could be collecting data from patients who don't always have to necessarily come to the hospital anymore. But everybody is afraid to use wireless technology because they don't know how, quote, the FDA will respond. So we need Congress to get the FDA to be very proactive in responding to say, we will figure out a way where you can use that wireless technology. The rest of the world does it already in other industries. It's effective, it makes a big difference, and really it's largely fear that's holding us back. We don't contest that there are some scientific issues to be ironed out, but we'd like to remove the unnecessary process burdens and the unnecessary uncertainties. Those are things we can do something about now. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your inviting us in today.
Thank you very much. And for FDASIA and PDUFA 5 are pieces of legislation passed through Congress over the past couple of years. Just let people know what that terminology is. We'll now turn to Brian Sladek, the Illinois chapter of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, who is a survivor also. So welcome, sir, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, and Congressman Shimkus and Congressman Davis, thank you very much for having us here today. I am with the Illinois chapter of Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. In fact, I'm the Director of Patient Access, Education, and Advocacy for the Midwest region. However, I'm not really here from a professional perspective today, rather a patient perspective. I'm a two-time non-Hodgkin lymphoma survivor. My journey with cancer began back in December of 1999. I was a junior in college, found a lump under my collarbone. Last thing I ever thought was cancer, but of course, went to the doctor, had some scans done. Sure enough, came back, stage 3, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Went back home. I was at the time at University of Central Florida. Went back home to Chicago, got treatment at Rush University Medical Center. I got put in a treatment protocol called CHOP, which is a kind of chemotherapy. Very brutal, the typical chemo side effects you hear about: nausea, hair loss, unable to focus, extremely tired. The good news was they gave me a very aggressive treatment because my disease itself was very aggressive. So they treated aggressively. I was relatively healthy aside from the cancer. So they hit me pretty hard with the treatment. It turned out within 3 treatments, my tumor had actually shrunk to what they could tell is just a calcified mass at this point. So I was responding very well to the treatment. They decided to go ahead with another 3 treatments just to be sure they catch all of this. In fact, I did so well, I qualified for a clinical trial at the time for a drug called Rituxan. Never heard of it before. My explained what it does is it seeks out specific cells. Traditional old chemotherapy basically carpet bombs, kills everything. This is a little bit different. It targets, in my case, the B cells, the cancer cells, and kills those, leaving the other cells relatively unharmed. So I was excited about this, but the FDA required I wait 6 weeks from my final treatment, my final regular chemo treatment, to get scans again to make sure the disease was stable, and then I could proceed with the clinical trial. Well, it turned out that 6 weeks go by, I get my scans done again, and the tumor had grown back to half of its original size within that time. So I no longer qualified for the clinical trial. The alternative, based on my doctor's recommendation, was a stem cell transplant. Which, to give you a little background for people that don't know what that is, basically I was able to harvest my own stem cells from my bone marrow. The stem cells go on to create any kind of cell your body might need. Well, what they do is they harvest those, freeze them. They check you into the hospital for, in my case, it was 3.5 weeks. In that time, they give you extremely high-dose chemotherapy, which effectively destroys your immune system. They monitor your white blood cell counts until they get about as low as possible, while still keeping you alive. And then everyone crosses their fingers and they put your previous stem cells back in The idea being to kind of regenerate your immune system from scratch. I was excited about the possibility of a cure, so I was very excited about that, but it's definitely a more costly, more risky alternative to, say, doing the clinical trial that was originally recommended for me. Well, I got out of the hospital 3.5 weeks later. 4 or 5 months later, I'm completely in remission from cancer at this point. This is in 2000. I had 10 more years of remission, and I was actually diagnosed again at the age of 30 in 2010, diagnosed again with the same B-cell, large B-cell, non-Hodgkin lymphoma. This time I find out that the standard protocol treatment includes this Rituxan that I would have received as a clinical trial before. So this is 10 years later, standard protocol. I receive it, and obviously I'm here today, 4 years later. So extremely grateful for the work that's done in our universities, the research facilities. Again, mine being Rush University Medical Center, where I received my treatment, and just extremely grateful for their ability to find these, because this is where a lot of these cures are coming from, these research centers. So glad to be here today. Glad to share my story of a little bit of how being denied a clinical trial at a certain point, timing-wise, affected me negatively. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you. Now I want to turn to Doug Carlson, Professor of Pediatrics, Washington University, St. Louis Children's Hospital in my neck of the woods. So welcome.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this important process. While I am currently the Professor of Pediatrics at Washington University and the Associate Chief Medical Officer for Quality and Safety at St. Louis Children's Hospital, in 3 weeks I will be assuming the position of Chair of Pediatrics here at SIU School of Medicine and the Medical Director for St. John's Children's Hospital, and a proud native of Decatur. So I really wanted to talk about sort of academic medical centers and really the mission of that and how it fits with improving healthcare across the board in the United States. There really are three main missions for that, and there are other missions too, but the three main ones that we've got are really first and foremost improving outcomes of patients, providing care. I've spent my career not in discovery science, but implementation and building clinical programs in the St. Louis area. Most of improving care of kids in St. Louis, hopefully some of the things have been taken in improving care across the country, but that implementation. Really looking at the academic medical centers, because of their locations, have accepted the responsibility with taking care of our often sickest patients, and in my case children, and also those that are at most risk because of our urban locations. It's important that academic medical centers continue to be cost effective in their care. Part of the change of volume to value, we understand that, but it's important to understand that we are, as academic medical centers broadly, including what is done here in Springfield, part of the safety net for care for children and adults. The second goal of academic medical centers is training our next generation of clinicians, physicians, and other caregivers, so that group can go on and continue the great advances and really hopefully be the group that finds cures for many of the things that we've not found cure for, and not just discovery of those things, but implementation of the things that we know. It is sometimes hard for me to believe when I talk to groups of people to understand that it's not only finding new information, we actually as a healthcare system don't do as well as we should of taking what we know and delivering it to patients in a cost-effective way. It is important that we continue that journey for cost-effective, equitable, efficient, timely, family-centered care so that all populations in the United States benefit from that. The third important mission of an academic medical center is the research, both in discovery and implementation research. NIH dollars have basically remained flat in total terms over the last decade, which means that in actual buying power have gone down significantly. I can see that at my institution, our NIH dollars in Washington University has any range from 2 to 5, and that range for the amount of NIH dollars into the system. But what I'm seeing is that is not the part. I'm not a discovery researcher. I've had small grants, but I don't support myself on grants. I do support myself by clinical care. I'm seeing that our best and brightest physicians who were choosing between discovery research and application of patient care are more often being discouraged about going into discovery research because the career path and the amount of competitiveness for those the dollars is getting harder and harder. The United States has been a leader in biomedical research worldwide for almost a century. I'm worried that we are becoming not the dominant discoverer in biomedical research. And I think that our dedication for basic science research and implementation research needs to be looked at carefully. I think it will benefit in better outcomes, and I think economically it makes sense to have the United States be the preeminent provider of discovery in biomedical research.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to my colleague, Congressman Davis, to make the next introduction.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the 13th District. We're glad to have you. I get the privilege of introducing some new friends of mine. As you know, I mentioned them as I came in late for my introduction, and if I would have seen them from behind, I probably would have smacked him in the back as I was going by. Steve Rockford is fighting ALS right now. The ALS Ice Bucket Challenge has been something that has gone viral via social media, and it's to help ALS find a cure for people like Steve. Steve and Tammy came out to Washington, D.C. I met them in my office, and they talked to me about their fight against ALS. Steve and Tammy both grew up here on the north side of Springfield. Steve was recently a wrestling and football coach at Southeast High School, one of the schools that serves my district. He's shown the courage to fight ALS, but also he and Tammy have shown more courage in helping others in the future to find a cure. So I'd like to turn it over to Steve and Tammy.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to attend today. And like you mentioned, we're here to represent all men and women and families that are affected by this horrible disease. Our biggest thing with the Modern Cures Act is to cut down that we don't have 15 years to waste in a clinical trial, and you had mentioned that as well, Mr. Smith, but it cost over $1 billion to develop a new drug for ALS. We were, when we were in Washington, we were informed about a diaphragm pacing system. And so when we got home, we called our doctor. He said, I'll send you wherever you want to go. There's a study in Ohio that you could be a part of. So I call Ohio, and they said, well, there's a 50% placebo group. And, and I said, thank you very much. I'm going to make another phone call because we don't want to be in a placebo group. So we called the surgeon that created the diaphragm pacing system direct. We had an appointment within 2 weeks. And you go on a Monday, you spend all day in pre-op appointments, and by the end of the day, they tell you whether you're a candidate or not. For those of you who aren't familiar with the disease, it's a neuromuscular disease that affects your motor neurons. They stop firing signals to your muscles start to waste away, which in most cases it ends in respiratory failure because your diaphragm is a muscle that supports your breathing. The diaphragm pacer that my husband had put in back in June, there's electrodes that are attached to both sides of his diaphragm that pump his diaphragm. It doesn't necessarily improve the quality of his breathing, but it sustains his breathing. And studies have shown that it puts off the need for a ventilator for up to 16 months. So going to the source, the man who created it was a no-brainer for us, but there's other people that may not have the resources to travel out of state to have these sort of things done. There's another gentleman in the area that is a single father. His 7th grade daughter is caring for him. He's the youngest of 10 children. The community has really gathered around us and been a huge support to us over the last 2 years. He was diagnosed back in May of 2012. So after he has a feeding tube now. He had to quit his job back in January because the disease has affected his speech, so he can no longer coach, which that was his passion, that was his driving force. We have 5 children, ages 9, 10, 11, 15, and 17. So it's been quite the journey for all of us, but at this point in the game, we just want to see action and stop wasting our time with 10 years of a study. We have 3 to 5, maybe. You know, some people live 10 years with it, but we've come across people. There were several gentlemen that were diagnosed within months of Steve, and they're already gone. So time is of the essence with diseases like ALS. And that ice bucket challenge, that just shows how social media, I mean, it's been a frenzy. And maybe people that, you know, there was a lot of teenagers that were blowing up YouTube doing this ice bucket challenge that really didn't know the meaning behind it, but it probably made them Google the disease to learn, well, what is this ALS, you know, and that's get the word out. Because, you know, now that we're a part of that community, you always run into somebody that has a family member or a friend that was affected by this disease. And 75 years is when, 75 years ago, Lou Gehrig was diagnosed. And why has it been 75 years and we still have no cure? I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add. It's something that he mentioned a lot while we were in Washington with the multiple people we met with. It's a hopeless disease. You know, cancer has chemo, diabetes has insulin, but for right now, you know, I mean, you have to really rely on your faith to face each day and be strong. Because we have 5 sets of eyes watching everything that we do. And, you know, if we fall apart, then they don't have any hope. So, you know, but thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We appreciate it.
Well, I think you've said enough by your presence and your commitment, and so we appreciate that. And it is about people who need help, need assistance, and that's what I think the committee is trying to do, again, in a bipartisan manner, to try to move forward and try to understand the stumbling blocks and try to push through those stumbling blocks. So now I'd like to turn to Thomas Phillipson. He's been an economic advisor to the FDA and also CMS, and so obviously he's been in the bowels of some of these agencies that we're talking about. So we look forward to your testimony.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm a professor at University of Chicago, which is about 3 hours from here. I discovered 6 in the morning today. So
no sympathy, I told you, based upon my district. No sympathy.
So I'm an economist by training, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what economists have done in this area and what I think could be improved in terms of stimulating medical innovation. So economists at University of Chicago and many places elsewhere have shown, basically, if you look at the value of health over time, that the last century, the most important change we faced in the world was probably the growth in health, meaning we doubled life. And if you estimate the economic value of that, it comes on par with all GDP growth during that period. So if you think of your favorite innovation, whether it's the railroad or internet or whatever, you add them all up, and that's the total value of actually doubling life according to most economic studies. So it's very important what has happened in the past. The question is whether it's going to be continued. We're doing work with Abbott. I'm also a founding partner of a company called Precision Health Economics, and we're doing joint work with Abbott on basically measuring the health of populations across the world to better guide policymakers essentially to the value of health as opposed to GDP measures, which do not measure the value of health. It measures the transactions taking place in an economy, but it doesn't measure the value of health, and therefore people looking at how much economies grow do not really take into account how much health is improving or not. But so the question is this positive trend that we've seen the last 100 years going to continue? And that's going to depend heavily on medical innovation. If you look at medical innovation, it comes from pretty big investments because it's very costly to bring treatments to markets. And research in medical innovation is mainly not stimulated by profits. I have a lot of colleagues at the University of Chicago. They don't really care about money. That's why they're there, because we're paying them so little. But when you bring a product to market in development, you will need investors. Once you need investors, all they care about is the rate of return on investment. And so they're looking at an investment where it takes 10 or 15 years until the product gets launched, and with a 90% probability it's not going to happen. And then they look at WhatsApp, which is $17 billion in 2 years. So their trade-off in looking at medical innovation investments is very, very dire at this point, because it's taking so long to get their rate of return, and it's so uncertain that they're getting a rate of return. We have done a lot of research at the university indicating that, in fact, medical and R&D investors must be compensated, therefore, for this risk in capital markets much more than other industries. So what does that mean? That means that it's costlier to raise funds for people investing in R&D, in medical R&D. Why? Because it's so risky. Part of this risk, we believe, is, unfortunately, the government. That is so risky to predict what's going to happen at FDA, CMS, etc., and it's very hard to understand what that risk looks like in the future, that you must be compensated for that risk. Just as a corporate bondholder has to pay, they have to pay their corporate debt rates above treasury rates because they might go bankrupt, you need to compensate investors more if there's more risk. And the risk here is FDA risk and CMS risk. How much, if you're going to get the product approved and when you're going to get paid for it. So the question becomes, how do we stimulate these investments for investors? And I think that the financial aspect of this, I think, is important to bring into this, because I think it's very, very, very important. We have a lot of research on rich people's diseases that are large for this reason, that there's a profit mode in medical R&D investments. You might not like that, but that's the way the world works. We don't have rare disease R&D because there's no profits in small customer bases. And the question is, how can the government essentially correct that? We are involved with, I'm also a fellow at the Milken Institute, and we're involved in developing, and I think this should be pushed by this group as well, better financial markets for hedging this government risk. How do you basically hedge FDA non-approval risk or FDA non-delays if you're a medical investor? There's no way of doing that right now. You're just sitting waiting for FDA to approve your drug or not, and it can take forever. There's ways of doing that in the financial markets that essentially ensures you get that risk. Also, we don't have medical product futures. What does that mean? We don't have basically the same thing as in corn markets, where you can basically, if you're a farmer, you can basically agree on a future price in the futures market, and therefore you go and plant your seeds in the land and you sell it in the future. You know what's going to happen. Here we have no idea what CMS is going to pay for medical technologies in 10 or 15 years. There's no way of hedging that risk, or the political risk, the Medicare spending risk in Washington. There's no way of hedging that risk if you're a medical R&D investor. So we need better financial markets for investors to eliminate these risks they face by engaging in medical R&D. Another thing we need is better international agreements. I don't know if this is the purview of this committee, but U.S. is about 50% of profits, if not more, of a compound that gets on the world market, even though U.S. is only about 20% of world GDP. So we're overrepresented in how much we're paying for medical treatments relative to other countries, mainly Europe and Japan. And China is now stepping in, and they have a lot of growth in their market, obviously, but they're still small as a share of world returns to medical innovations. So medical innovations earn a world return, mostly paid for by the U.S. customer. And therefore, French and German and Swedish customer or patients are benefiting from the U.S. policies. But what needs to be put in place is some kind of international agreements that allow, less free riding on the U.S. Patients across the world. I don't know what international bilateral agreements should be made, but it's clear that in medical innovation, U.S. is contributing far more to the profits of innovation than in many other sectors. And I think it's a matter of if we can get those international agreements in place, we can also lower our own prices in Medicare and Medicaid and the private sector as well, because medical innovation wouldn't be so reliant on making the money in the U.S. Lastly, I have two wish list things that I wish this committee would think about. One is, if you talk about 21st century cures, we don't have financial markets to finance cures. What do I mean by that? So look at Gilead, who currently now have a Hep C cure. By cure, I mean you have an early expenditure that you're going to have a lifelong benefit from. In other markets, we have credit markets to take place to finance those things. So if you go to school, you take a student loan. You take a big loan and you pay it to the university, very expensive at University of Chicago, and you basically pay that later on when you benefit from the education later on in life. Same with mortgages. You pay your upfront cost of the house, and then you pay the cost of that later on when you live in the house. We don't have that for medical treatment. Hep C costs $86,000. Very few people can afford that. They have to go to their plans. But you could easily have health care loans that basically have that amortized over a lifetime, because you benefit from not having hepatitis C for the rest of your life. Those kind of credit markets for cures, which is, I think, if this is focused on cures, I think should be very, very central to this committee. How do we finance very valuable expenditures so that innovators like Pfizer and others can actually bring to market things that people value, but they pay for it with their credit market instruments? So there wouldn't be as big a housing market if everyone had to pay for their house up front. Or there wouldn't be as many people attending college if we didn't have student loans. Same thing, people wouldn't capture the value of these innovations if they couldn't pay the lifelong benefit of the innovation as they live through the treatment or the value of the treatment. My last point is regarding NIH. I think we should be making major investments, which we're not, mimicking what was done for HIV in the case of obesity. Obesity is probably the biggest problem that we're going to be facing in Medicare and Medicaid going forward. We're not investing in medical R&D. What we are investing in is trying to change people's behavior, eating and physical fitness. That's a dead end. The private industry has been trying to do this for years, has not succeeded. It's not clear why the public sector would be better than the fitness industry and the diet industry in achieving these goals. What we should do is mimic HIV, where we solve the problem with medical innovation. HIV is similar to obesity because people like having sex and they like to eat, it turns out. Biologists think that has to do with that we want to carry forward our gene. Maybe that's true, but it's a very strong desire. So even in presence of health risks, HIV continues, and even in presence of obesity risk, eating continues. Smoking is not a good role model for obesity because we don't need to smoke. We can drop it and be pretty happy. But medical R&D into obesity, where basically we medically solve, or through medical treatment, solve the imbalance between calorie intake and calorie expenditures, I think is going to be the solution. Behavioral change is not going to be the solution. That's clear. People cannot control their behavior in a cheap calorie environment. And the question is, can we control it with medical innovation, just as we did with HIV, which was a massive public expenditure by NIH. And I think there's not enough attention being paid to more NIH focus on obesity.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Philipson's Swedish U.S. citizenship, so you can see it's a little more liberal in his the European influence here. So well, nice. Now, next, I'd like to turn to Raja Helene, who's the Illinois State Director for the Parkinson Action Network. Thank you for coming.
And thank you, Representative Davis, Representative Shimkus, for inviting me here today and hosting this. As he said, I represent the Parkinson's Action Network. We're basically a grassroots patient advocacy group that represents patients and all of the other Parkinson's-related disease organizations in Washington, D.C. We have a grassroots network of about 180 people across the country, and we represent Michael J. Fox Foundation, the Davis Finney Foundation, National Parkinson's Disease Foundation, and others on Capitol Hill. Parkinson's disease is the second most neurodegenerative disease next to Alzheimer's, with approximately 1 million people in the United States that are currently having it and roughly 50,000 a year diagnosed with it. Currently, our only treatment really in the pharmaceutical end was a drug that was developed 50 years ago. So with all of our medical advances, we still are using a drug that was developed 50 years ago, the carbidopa-levodopa. There is a surgical procedure called deep brain stimulation that can set a patient back maybe 7 or 8 years, but it's not a cure. They still tend to progress. The 4 major symptoms of Parkinson's disease that everybody thinks of, which is balance, tremor, the slowness, and that, are really the outward symptoms. It's all the non-movement disorder symptoms that come with it. And the list keeps growing. Sleep disturbances, constipation, memory issues, a number of them like that. Basically, I travel the state doing support group talks, Parkinson's events for Parkinson's Action Network, for a couple other Parkinson's groups that I do. And as I travel the state, I see these people that lives have been affected with the disease, their family, their caregivers. I see the uncertainties that they face, wondering whether they'll be able to take a step a second from now, whether they'll fall because of their imbalance, whether they can write the words they're thinking about. And I understand how they can become embarrassed and brought to tears as they struggle with their dyskinesia, just to do the simple things in life that we all take for granted, like pulling up your pants and buttoning your shirt, feeding yourself, things like that. As a community, we're hopeful about our prospects for the development of new therapies for Parkinson's, and believe that the scientific community is close to developing the tools needed for this fight. However, we are concerned that the current system lacks the incentives for industry to invest and move the targets through the pipeline for the medical needs of the central nervous system. In fact, data shows that the process to develop drugs for the central nervous system conditions, including Parkinson's, takes longer and is more costly and has a higher failure rate than the development process of drugs to treat other conditions. Accordingly, industry has shifted away their investments in treatment for these diseases, further exacerbating the situation. Ultimately, we want to ensure that we have a level playing field for the science and ensure that the bright ideas are not abandoned because of the business prospects, but are invested in and brought through the development process to the industry, the capitalists, and to others that will invest in the complicated medical needs of the central nervous system diseases. Through the use of creative tax laws, patient information reform, and exclusively provisions or other systems of reform, if there is a good science to pursue on Parkinson's, we want to ensure that it is not benched because of greater cost and less likelihood to succeed. In addition, Congress must increase investments in biomedical research in order to spur the development and future treatments and cures. In January 2014, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes at the National Institute of Health approved a list of 31 priorities, research recommendations specific to Parkinson's that highlight the areas in which the National Institute of Health and broader fields should direct its resources to achieve the greatest impact in addressing the treatments and the underlying cause of the disease. These recommendations were the results of an intensive planning process that brought together clinicians, researchers, and patients in the Parkinson's community to determine the area of greatest need to reform and how to approach the disease. We applaud the National Institute of Health for their leadership in this effort, which represented an unparalleled opportunity to coordinate the critical initiatives and to help unlock the mysteries of Parkinson's. But its success is dependent upon the strengthening and funding of National Institute of Health, and to ensure that sufficient capacity and resources are available. We strongly encourage Congress to support the implementation of the 31 Parkinson's recommendations by increasing funding for the National Institute of Health to fully fund the brain research through Advancing Innovative Technologies Initiative, which aims to better understand the human brain through new technologies, tools, mapping, and the neuron circuits. The people with Parkinson's that I often meet ask why the main treatment for Parkinson's is based on nearly a 50-year-old pharmaceutical treatment, which treats only some of the symptoms for a limited time with limiting side effects. And they ask why, with all the innovative advances made in medicine, more can't be done to help them. They feel left out and alone with their struggles. Really, they don't ask for a lot, just that the National Institute of Health receives adequate funding for biomedical research, and that the FDA, industry, and other stakeholders work together to speed up development of new drugs and therapies that will be beneficial to all. And I'd like to thank you once again for inviting us here.
Thank you for coming and your testimony. I'd like to turn to Nancy Goodman, who is the founder of Kids versus Cancer.
Thank you very much, Congressman Shimkus and Congressman Davis, for inviting me here today. I come as founder of Kids versus Cancer, but first as a mother. My son, Jacob, died of a pediatric brain cancer, medulloblastoma. And what I learned through the experience of Jacob's illness and then death is that children's cancers are different from adult cancers. Children's often need different drugs than adult needs for cancer treatment, and they largely do not exist. When Jacob was diagnosed, we were given a drug protocol by Jacob's medical team that included drugs that were 30 and 40 years old, and the protocol Jacob received had not materially changed in decades. There was very little probability of success, and yet his physicians continued that treatment because there were just no other alternatives available. So why is that? We think of the pharmaceutical industry, in particular the oncology drug development portion, is very innovative, and why is it that we're not getting more benefits to children? At Jacob's death, I founded Kids versus Cancer. I'm also a University of Chicago Law School graduate, and following in the tradition of Chicago, I focused on the question of how we can get reasonable rates of returns for drug development for children with cancer and other life-threatening diseases. And in doing so, I focused on the Creating Hope Act, which we wrote and successfully lobbied for. It was passed as part of the 2012 FDA Safety and Innovation Act. And what the Creating Hope Act does is it creates an incentive for drug companies so that if they develop a drug, for example, for Morquio-A syndrome or a pediatric cancer, they have a drug that's approved now, but their opportunity for a reasonable rate of return may not be there. And so we've created a system where they receive a voucher. The voucher is fully transferable, and it comes with rights to a faster FDA review on any other drug, perhaps a large market drug. So we are very happy to report that the first Creating Hope Act pediatric priority review voucher just sold a few weeks ago for $67.5 million, proving that this system works. And who won? The kids with Morquio-A syndrome won because they now have a drug that can treat their symptoms. BioMarin won $67.5 million by selling their voucher. Sanofi and Regeneron won by being able to purchase this voucher to use for another drug they are rushing to market. And the taxpayers won because there are no budget implications to this program. So thank you for working with us to ensure passage. We have still 2 steps to take in ensuring that the Creating Hope Act is a successful program. First, we are working with the FDA on implementation. There's a question as to whether the Creating Hope Act will extend to pediatric cancer drug development, and I hope we can resolve that. And second, we will need to permanently reauthorize the Creating Hope Act, and I look forward to working with you, Congressman Davis and Congressman Shimkus, on reauthorizing it permanently when the time comes. The Creating Hope Act addresses one piece of the problem, but there's much more to go in creating incentives for pediatric cancer and pediatric rare disease drug development. We're now looking at the question of what opportunities, in particular in the cancer space, we can take to benefit from all the drug development that is occurring for adult cancers. The pipeline for adult cancer drug development is 900 drugs approximately. And but the problem with that is almost all 900 are for adult cancers. The number of clinical trials in the United States now for pediatric cancer that include an unapproved drug is de minimis. We're really doing this study right now, but it could be 10. And so what that means is more than 95% of all pediatric cancer clinical trials use only approved drugs. Children are not benefiting from all the exciting innovation that's occurring in oncology drug development. We do have some laws that address this issue, Pediatric Research Equity Act and Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act. The truth is, at least in the cancer space, they have not had impact. One example, I'm just going to give you a couple examples just to demonstrate the extent to which children have not benefited from some of these unapproved drugs. There's a new drug that was just approved by the FDA yesterday, a PD-1 inhibitor by Merck. It's a very exciting drug and could potentially be curative for many terminal cancers. There are about 50 trials now underway with different PD-1 and PD-L1 drugs by Merck and other companies. And no pediatric trials. There's never been a child who's benefited from this drug. Now it's, of course, approved, and that's very exciting. But the problem is that if we don't start clinical trials for children earlier in the drug development process, it's not only that kids with terminal cancer don't benefit from exciting unapproved drugs. It's also that in instances in which targeted therapies turn out not to be effective on adult cancers, we have no scientific information to determine whether those drugs should be continued to be developed for pediatric cancers. And instead, what now happens when drugs fail in drug development for adult cancers is the drug development process is terminated, clinical supply of the drugs are disposed of, and there's never any opportunity to see if all those hundreds of millions of dollars invested in adult drug development could possibly benefit children. So I look forward to working with you, Congressman Davis and Congressman Shimkus. There are many ways we can resolve this issue, and I think it's really a pressing one for us. I want to just briefly touch on two other points before I conclude, if I could. Compassionate use has been a very charged political issue recently in Washington, D.C. and around the country. There have been some very well-reported cases, in particular of children with cancer whose families had major social media programs to seek compassionate use access to drugs. I have some thoughts about how we could reform the compassionate use program, but more importantly, what I want to stress in the area of pediatric cancer drug development is families would be very happy going on clinical trials. They just do not exist. And that's why kids are turning to compassionate use. And really, we have to make sure that clinical trials are early. And just a final comment on funding. I realize that funding NIH is not directly in your purview, but as members of Congress, it is something that is important for you to address. Even in this area of fiscal constraints, I hope you will protect NIH's budget. It's so important for so many rare disease drug development programs. And in addition, I hope you'll work with us to look for ways to make the funds that are allocated to the NIH and to the NCI more effective. We've identified several specific programs. They are not carve-outs. They are not requests to specifically fund pediatric cancer. They are ideas to create a better process in prioritizing what are the most scientifically impactful studies that we can have our researchers at the NIH and NCI fund. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here. When you lose a child with cancer, you don't lose him for a day. I lose Jacob every single day. I wake up and I wonder, I see a tall 15-year-old boy, and I wonder how much Jacob would look like him or not look like him. Jacob had red hair. That kid might have brown hair. This kid has huge feet. I wonder whether Jacob would too now. And it goes on forever, and I hope we can all work in a world where future parents don't have to wake up and see a teenage boy and wonder that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and obviously I'm just blown away by the great testimony of the folks here and the stories. And we started with our host, Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. We're going to end there, at least for this portion. Kevin McVary, Dr. McVary, Professor and Chair of Urology of the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. So thank you.
So, Congressman, thank you for allowing me to talk today. And I'd like to say to the panel, I agree with your comments. I'm really encouraged and heartened by the testimony and the comments from each of you. So before I start, who am I? I'm Kevin McVary. I'm a urologist. I'm a Springfield-born boy. Lived here till high school, went to Northwestern, never came home. I went there for college, medical school, residency, fellowship. I was a professor for 25 years and practiced in downtown Chicago. Came back to Springfield with the opportunity to lead urology here and try and make a difference in rural Southern Illinois in terms of urology problems. I think, why am I here today? I think in part because I've had a hand in discovery, I've had a hand in development, and a hand in development policy and other factors as chairman, but also in the national scene with our associations. So I'm a physician investigator. I see patients, but I also have a basic science lab. I run clinical trials among guideline panels, etc. And with that, my focus has been on prostate diseases, prostate cancer, and BPH, a more benign prostate disease, very common, and surprising to some of you, maybe, sexual dysfunction. Why is that? Well, it turns out that these diseases are linked. They're linked through obesity and linked for inflammatory diseases. They have, although seldom lethal, some of these diseases that we focus on, they have huge impact on the quality of life of men. They would rate a ER visit for a benign prostate problem the same level that other people would rate a heart attack or stroke. So as physicians, we may say, or as outsiders, this is not so critical, right? They're going to survive it. When you look at the patient perspective, it's a big event in their life. There's a huge at-risk population, and the cost is in billions of dollars. So how have we tried to approach these things? One major approach is randomized controlled trials, both for devices and for medications. And there are distinct differences between some of the things that I do and what I've heard from folks here today. I've probably been involved in some place above 100 clinical trials. I've written many of the protocols for the NIH, for the other federal groups, and stuff here, investigator-initiated trials. These are useful techniques, but they are laborious, they're expensive. They have a great advantage, a defined phenotype. Who is this guy we're treating? The problem is it generalizable? You focus so much on the type of person in it that it's hard to extend it to the general population. And it's a balance that we fight, that we know, and I'm hearing from many of you folks here today. Patient registries is a newer technique that we've tried. It's a lot easier, but then again, it's a balance between, well, who are these people in these registries that we're treating, and really, is that applicable? Do we really know what we're doing when we don't have defined phenotypes? So it's a rough balance, and that's the thing that we fight every day. Have as I mentioned, a translational research lab at Northwestern, brought it here, recruiting people, interacted my entire career with molecular biologists, neuroscientists, statisticians, etc., and I say stiffs like me. And this has been very rewarding intellectually. I'd like to say that some of the things have made a big difference in people's lives. There's problems. There's problems because are we attracting the best and the brightest? And are the young men and women interested in spending time in the lab and committing really a career to this when benefits to them personally may be much greater elsewhere? Or maybe just the uncertainty, is there going to be a position for me, a postdoc fellowship, a place for me when I finish? And in my view, that's a critical problem for us, especially in something small like urology. We don't have the big advocacies, the big groups that many other disease states have. Genetics. We're just starting to dabble of this in many parts of prostate diseases and sexual function. And I can tell you there are, at the disposal of the NIH, there are established tissue banks, serum banks, which we in part created in the early 90s. Genetics would be a great place to tap this. We cannot do that because of the consenting. The IRB process now is so different than where we cannot do genetic analysis without specific patient consent, and it wasn't done in the 90s, early 90s, because it wasn't created. It's inaccessible. It'd be a great step forward for us. I think experts in policy have spoken, and I won't belabor the roles that we've had in that and where the problems are. In my recent foray back to my hometown, I've become involved in the disparities of rural Illinois, and they are stark. Rural Illinois has the highest rate of kidney cancer in the country for reasons which are unexplored. We just had this published recently. We're going to explore it, but there's a lot of problems in doing that, and I'll touch on that in a second. And lastly, device innovation, something which is really exciting. We developed a program which we brought here, which we call the Stanford Model, using collaborative groups of clinicians looking at problems, engineers in the operating room watching us, lawyers to protect what our intellectual rights are, and business MBA Kellogg School specifically to help us protect these. It's really exciting, but you do see the cogs and the rust and the problems as you go along. So, but all that said, I'm really hopeful. I'm very positive that this can be overcome. Why? I mean, we've done these things, and we're just urologists. Think about that. We can do more. And I think the strength that I see with these efforts is really collaboration. A clinician like myself, it only has a certain skill set, and we need collaboration with the feds. We need collaboration with NIH, industry and pharma, independent research foundations, which I've become increasingly involved in because of their big data sets, access to NHANES bases and stuff like that. And then, network of universities that are interested in procuring the best and brightest people. So where are our problems? It's been said before, it is a resource issue. And I advocate for the NIH and the importance that is, not just personally, but for all of urology and really all of clinical medicine. There's lots of roadblocks, and some of which I think legislation could help, and I'm talking about the interference, the inadvertent interference of HIPAA, certain aspects of HIPAA rule and IRB restrictions, and oversight from other advocacy groups that don't cherish basic science laboratory work. So changes in this collaboration have to happen. If I write a grant and I want to bring someone from another university into it, my efforts here get subtracted because of the way the monies are divided up. It's an administrative problem. That can be changed, but there are rules for this. And then last, I'd say a focus away from what I call safe science. Hey, we got a box here, we know X, Y, Z, let's start checking some of these boxes. It is low-hanging fruit, but it's not disruptive. It's not innovative enough. And too often, the funding people, the funding mechanisms are really guided towards, they want the sure bet, as opposed to taking a chance. And I've seen that personally, but also then on the other side, it's review bodies where you're not sure as a reviewer if this is a good idea. So you have to, I guess, balance that. But I think there is definitely room for improvement. With that, I'll wrap it up. I hope I'm less than 3 minutes. Thank you for hearing me.
No, actually, we've done great, and it's a good topic to end on before we go to the questions. And we are going to have 30 minutes to interact, and we don't want to leave just the questions. We want you all can interact with each other. We do have a card here, which we'll end up reading. Before that, I want to turn to Rodney, and then I'm going to obviously do something on funding. So. which is a purview that we have.
I look forward to hearing your questions, and I also look forward to the interaction with our panelists. But I did see the Dean and Provost of the SIU School of Medicine, Kevin Dorsey, walk in. Kevin is, his practice had been as a rheumatologist, so there's really not a specialty that's seen such advances due to drugs and due to other therapeutic modalities over the years and over his career. So thank you, Kevin, for being here, and thanks for allowing this to even happen.
So let me, Chris, I asked him to give me some markers, because I think what's important too is I think we all know that research dollars need to go into NIH, and the whole debate about why, and just the whole budget application. So briefly, I'm just going to do this.
He's a former teacher.
I am. 2013, 3.45. Technology's great. I had this on my Dropbox. And I just want to point out a few things. So we go here, 221 billion interest payments. Medicaid is 265 billion. That's my students always worried about my handwriting too, but I was a teacher, so I didn't care. Medicare, 492 billion. Social Security, 808 billion. And then we go, this is not exactly right. Oh yeah, no, it is. Other mandatory,
It's government math.
467 billion. And then we go to two other slices of the pie, which is non-defense, discretionary, 576 billion, and defense, 625 billion. And the only point I'm making, when people come to my office all the time, I always end up with this, because what's happening in our country right now is the red is on automatic control. So think about running a business, think about running a hospital, and business would call this legacy costs, pension, healthcare benefits, that start out stripping the money that's coming in. So these are all on automatic growth. When we fight over budgetary dollars in Washington, we're only fighting over the green part. So I was going to ask Chris, so non-defense, here's defense, 625 billion, here's non-defense discretionary, 566 billion. So when we're talking about NIH, it's in here somewhere. Okay? And Chris can give me the number, exactly what that amount is. My concern is this: as these things continue to grow, health outcomes, amazing activities, men now live to mid-70s, women live to mid-80s, versus 20 years ago or 30 when it was 65. These grow, these get squeezed. The challenge is not more money in some of these areas, or our fight is redefining proper spending. So I just wanted to point out that, because NIH is critical in this debate. Reducing risk in capital expenditures and doing that innovative first line of study. And we've got so many acronyms in the federal government. NIH, you've heard that here. Oops, God, I'm terrible, sorry. NIH. Then we got CDC, right? And we got HHS. And then we have CMS. What else did I write down here? FDA. And there's probably a whole bunch more that are this. So part of the 21st Century Cures is trying to get these folks to work more cooperatively so that we get a bigger return on, bigger bang for the buck of the dollar to move things quicker, which then lowers risk, my guess. So I just wanted to throw that up, because I always talk about this also, is because we need your help in telling the story. No one believes this. They don't believe this part of the budget. And so if we want to increase this, we have to reform these. It's just a fact of life. So, having said that, let me go from out in the audience. So this is the ooh. I didn't read this before I did that chart up there. How can government further encourage public-private collaboration on research projects that benefit patients? A lot of testimony, that's what we would like to see. More NIH funding. So whoever wrote that out there, I was getting the vibes. A new dedicated program. I've probably a question to us too, but it's a question for many of you in your advocates. So, Mr. Smith.
That's an excellent question, and also relating to the pie chart. The Creating Hope Act that Nancy Goodman just talked about, I want to reiterate it because it's really a historic piece of legislation that creates what I think we're looking for. And we think of election coming around, and both sides of the aisle are needed in this fight. This act, Nancy said it, but I want to emphasize it. It shifts revenue that's created by big blockbuster drugs that are known to be very lucrative into rare disease research and drug development, which is known to be struggling for funding. It's not taking government money at all. It's shifting from the private sector into the private sector. So that's really excellent. Another example of that is there's an NIH-driven clinical trial called LungMath, which is a sort of a trial of the future, but it's happening now, and it's lung cancer. And it incorporates into one clinical trial what often would be spread out into 5 to 20 clinical trials. They are screening for 5 drugs, they're screening for 20 genetic mutations, and they're putting patients, and so there are efficiencies, but that's funded not, there may be some government funding, but 5 different independent private pharmaceutical companies are putting the funds into that trial, but it's doing something very futuristic for us. Besides consolidating all that effort, it's allowing the data to be held independently by the National Cancer Institute. The Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, which is a leading cancer research institute, is doing the analysis, so that each pharmaceutical company isn't holding on to that data as intellectual property. And although that's important for them to do, they should do that if it's their data. But in this case, they're funding it, and the government is allowing it and facilitating it. So I think that's a really nice public-private balance. Money mostly coming from private sector.
Excuse me, and in the case of that protocol, if I may just add, it's less expensive for each company to participate in that lung master protocol than it would be to conduct their own trials, to test their own drugs.
And I think that's something that we've seen in the sector too, is in other parts of the government is if there could be some collaboration with the private sector in doing the research, and then however they figure out the proprietary information and what they pull from it. That's kind of important also, because there's got to be a return. But how do you be able to get more people involved and not doing their own thing? Yes, ma'am.
That's about NIH funding and programs, and the answer is yes, both. And there's a good example in the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, where a number of pharmaceutical companies and patient groups and NIH have come together to identify targets. Because still identifying targets that you can actually modify to change disease continues to be one of our biggest problems, and that is encouraging collaboration. Then the other is to increase the certainty, and we've seen how offering extended data exclusivity, which is basically a drug company's ability to use their investment in that clinical trial data without challenges to their patents. If you extend that creates additional incentives. So looking at where you could offer extended data exclusivity, and we've seen it in pediatrics, we've seen it in orphan drugs, it creates an additional incentive because you have longer time to recoup your investment. And there are more and more patent challenges. That's something that's increased over time. There's been a lot of innovation in challenging patents, and this would be a way to just really give companies more certainty that their investment in the clinical trial is going to be the right investment.
There's a great example of that, where one of the PD5 inhibitors we use for sexual dysfunction, in addition to dilating the blood vessels there, also helps improve wound healing and sclerodermics and things like this. But because of this same issue, Pfizer was the first one to really explore it. They were unwilling to invest in, and was a kind of a niche area for them. because they didn't have, they wouldn't have the return, and it was really low-hanging fruit. So what happened? We started using it anyway, but then payment, et cetera, because it's not covered, But it's a great point.
I think one of the most important ways that collaboration could take place is for post-market surveillance of safety and efficacy by the private sector, driving a more lenient approval process. So what I mean by that, in the sense that if we can discover when things go wrong very quickly, there's no need to do 15 years of work trying to figure out if it's going to go wrong. So if we, with big data, et cetera, coming on, can do a much quicker job in the market to say, this is not working, pull it, that alleviates the need for having clinical trials for a decade to avoid that circumstance. If one person dies when a drug goes wrong, there's no need to have a 10-year period of testing whether a person's going to die or not. So I think that partnership needs to be developed, either in the public sector with the private sector working to provide that data. Now it's mandatorily reported through the ARS system and FDA for mortality, but it could be done with morbidity as well for effectiveness.
So, well, I'd say, but today we don't have the information technologies. They exist, but they're not in place to do that. To find those
But it
signals,
will-
amplify those signals,
it's
and
coming
make
on the
discoveries
market, yeah.
that we don't have those.
But it's coming on the market. It's coming on the market. People are going to be discovering these problems sooner and sooner. Social media is going to blow it up faster and faster. And basically, it's going to be much less damage when something goes wrong with the therapy. And if that's the case, it doesn't make sense to spend years trying to figure out if things go wrong.
You're absolutely right. There's going to be much more access to information on some of the new protocols that are being used and what kind of effect, either positive or adverse effects, may be coming down the pipeline. I think it's a great idea to simplify the process of pulling a drug. However, I mean, the elephant in the room on any of these drugs and protocols is, don't worry about that, is what isn't, and I think it leads to the delay in many drugs coming to market, is what's the liability? If you pull a drug sooner, does that mean the infomercials are going to come on sooner of how you can then get compensated for using a drug that may have worked great with you? So I guess I want to throw it out to the panel. I know it was mentioned once, but briefly, how much of an impact in delaying clinical trials and extending clinical trials, and how much of an impact does a liability, potential liability, come into play when looking to bring new drugs to market?
Well, one thing that we've argued is that the exemption issue, right? That if FDA, if the government says, we tested this is a safe product, it's been marked off as safe, and it then doesn't work on the market, you can't be liable. You cleared it as safe, no one knows where it's going to work on the market, but the company has provided evidence that it's safe.
But that speaks against what you just proposed on the move faster and then do post-market analysis, and then if something goes wrong, pull it, right?
No. I mean, we still want a quick withdrawal of the drug.
Right.
But are they then liable for that damage? If they provided all the evidence saying this is working, should they then be held liable? That's the exemption issue, that basically when you have a government body, should you then have private liability on top of it? Usually we have private liability to discipline people to do safe things. But here we have a body called FDA ensuring that you do safe things.
And in the rare disease market, I'm not sure liability is the issue or safety is the issue. It's proving efficacy. If you don't have a large patient population, you can't statistically rule out what an outlier is. And how do you, and this is what we're struggling with in the Duchenne community, is how do you prove to the FDA that a drug is effective in a progressive childhood disease that's not imminent death? Cancer, you could prove you lived or you died, it was successful or it wasn't. In Duchenne, where we don't even really understand how the genetic markers change the genetic error, you can have twins with the same genetic error and they have a different manifestation of the disease. So therefore, when you treat that disease, you're likely going to get a different result. It doesn't mean that it's not working. It's just working a little differently. and we talk about personalized medicine, and we're not there yet, but how do we get at proving that efficacy quickly? Literally, my son is coming into the 10th year. The drug's not approved yet. There's not a single safety issue in 10 years. What are we waiting on? The FDA is not sure it's effective. Does it? So,
Right.
those are some of the other side of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw out, because, and Chris always gets worried when I say some of the stuff that I say. But a lot of you talked about clinical trials, the placebo issue, timeliness, and there are states moving on, and Nancy, you talked about the public appeal by the family to get and how that could screw up the process of the investigation and the approval process. But there's also states moving on right to fight type legislation that would give the patient of the right, regardless of the outcome. There's no gatekeeper anymore. It's more of a libertarian view. It's a freedom of the individual to make choices versus having the government be a gatekeeper. So clinical trials, placebo, right to fight,
And then
the
reimbursement.
population of clinical trials, and the like. Anyone want to?
I'd just like to make a comment on the right to try laws. And I think it's an interesting program that addresses the wrong problem. So the problem with compassionate use is that if you have a loved one who is very ill and seeks an unapproved drug and does not qualify for clinical trial, how can that patient receive the drug? And there's a two-step process. First, the drug company manufacturing the drug must agree to provide the drug for the patient. And then second, the FDA must agree. Third, the hospital's IRB must agree. In fact, what actually happens, it's very confusing approaching a company developing a drug to identify whether that company will provide a compassionate use or not. In my case, actually, I approached 8 different companies seeking compassionate uses. And, one company, I contacted the chief medical officer. Another company, it was the person who was head of business development. My cousin's boyfriend was the third company. There's no process. And for many reasons, many of them good reasons, many of them we should talk about, companies say no almost all the time. When companies agree to compassionate use, then it goes to the FDA. The FDA, statistically speaking, agrees to compassionate access more than 95% of the time. They can do it over the telephone. So the problem with the compassionate use program, it is broken, but the problem is not that the FDA is saying no or saying no slowly. There are other problems, but that is not the case. And my concern with taking the FDA out of the process is who gets hurt. So Pfizer is never going to agree to a compassionate use in a right to try situation, I would guess, because why would you take a drug you care about and provide it to a patient and never confer with the FDA as to whether they agree? It could potentially threaten your entire drug development process of that drug. It would not, in my mind, be a business decision that would make sense for Pfizer. However, some guy selling snake oil who really doesn't have any intent of getting approval for his drug, he can go, sell it to me, so I can try to save Jacob for, $50,000 a year, and that's who's going to use the right to try laws. So I really think that's a program.
Could you tie that to the aspect of post-market FDA review and process and time?
It's a different question in my mind. That the post-market issue, which Tom refers to, is for clinical trials. Compassionate use is when a patient can't get into a clinical trial.
And in fact, the vast majority of compassionate use requests at Pfizer are in fact approved. But the first objective is to get a clinical trial completed within
Absolutely.
So that's always going to be the primary objective, because that's what you want, is the medicine to be out on the market. When they're not approved, it's for, again, it's the minority of cases, and it's for a number of reasons. It may be that the patient is so sick that it would be sort of more harm than good to grant use, or that there's a number of other reasons. But, this issue of there not being a consistent avenue for parents or patients, that is one that can and needs to be addressed. There should be clarity in how you get access to compassionate use, why you're denied, why you're not denied.
And again, in the rare disease community, when you're talking about a small biotech, company using a new technology to implement a new drug, there's no funding. There's actually no drug quantity. I mean, beyond funding, even if you're a billionaire and you're going to pay for it, they only have enough drugs frequently to take care of the subjects that they already have enrolled in a study. And some of the studies are as small as 12 patients. So we're not talking that, you have 1,000 patients in the study. There's some overflow. You probably can pick somebody else up. When you have 12 patients in the study and you're only manufacturing for an N of 12, there is no extra drug. And so you're putting, I think, I completely agree with Nancy. The FDA is not the issue with compassionate use. And the right to try laws are really just putting industry on the line. And as a mother of a child who 10 years ago we didn't have industry involved, we don't want industry on the line. We want industry to stay involved in our disease organization. We want industry to work hard for us, and we don't want parents knocking at their door and screaming that you have to provide my drug. I have a right to try. So there's a lot of things that went into that. I don't think that's a very well thought out, in my humble opinion, law.
That's why Chris always tells me not to talk about it. But you don't know unless you ask. I mean, and I'm fully confident myself to ask silly questions. So, can someone talk about the other thing that's important? And this is either a lot of these disease organizations are international, companies are international. Canadian approval, EU approval, the processes that work, the processes that don't, and maybe what can we take from other countries that we might think of something's going well and incorporate that into what the United States is doing. Go ahead, yeah.
Sorry. I guess probably lots of us do.
Yeah.
One of the regulations right now that's bothering us in the rare disease community is toxicology measurements before you can start a clinical trial. Have some regulations associated with them that are so driving up the time and the cost of doing that for some new biologics that are we have enough experience with not to really need those toxicology studies. The result is companies take their clinical trials to Europe where the threshold is lower. And they're saving money, they're saving time, and patients in the United States are cut off from being in those European trials since they don't live there. And the business and the jobs and the investment is taken over to Europe too. So when we talk about what can the United States Congress do about leadership in the United States, that's one thing that can be done. It's an FDA regulation, and it's something that apparently could require some outside pressure to say, here's an area that we understand you've known about, but you don't seem to be doing anything about. So I'm sure there are other areas.
That's a great example, and I've heard a little bit about that, but that's a great example. That's exactly what we're looking for.
I'd like to actually take that a step further. For rare diseases, including pediatric cancer, the cost of regulatory approval is very high as a proportion of the market size and the ultimate revenue stream for that drug. And so for a company to go to both the EU and to Europe and to the United States it's twice as expensive to get your drugs into market. I think for rare disease drug development, if a company receives approval under U.S. market, it should be recognized in Europe, and the company should have the right to sell it in Europe. And similarly, if the drug is approved under the EMA system in Europe, it should be sold in the United States. The FDA and the EMA do come out with different decisions, but nobody is alleging that either regulatory body is not an expert body that makes good decisions. I think for rare diseases, this really makes the most sense.
In fact, the draft guidance that PPMD submitted to the FDA in May was based on draft guidance that a group called Treat on Health in Europe had submitted to the EMU. And so we're trying to get a little more consistent in this is how we approve in Europe and this is how we approve in the States. So maybe we can close that discrepancy.
I appreciate that. I've got another card here that I want to read. I see these microphones. Chris, what are these microphones for? Are we doing a transcript or are we taping any of this? Okay, which I guess I should have given you a heads up earlier. My bad, sorry. Hope you didn't say anything that you didn't want to say. But because this, again, I really appreciate your efforts and your time, because we're going to take this back. We'll take this back to the committee. I serve on the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. And so these things will be part of that whole process, whether you had to go to Washington to testify or here. So Right. So let me read this last card, and I might answer a few questions as I go through. It's both sides. It's like when you have that test, and you can put it on a 3x5 card and you're writing real small, trying to get on. What is the end game for the 21st century cures? It's my view that Chairman Upton is all in on this. He's got 2 more years left. I think he'll survive this November re-election. He'll have 2 more years left as chairman, and I think this is his number one goal and objective, and that's why he spent all year this year doing this stuff to put this together. Is it legislation to speed up FDA's drug approval and process? I think clearly yes. That would be something that we would hope. Is it legislation to increase net funding for all the alphabet or NIH? NIH. You heard me, right? Were you here when I did this? All right. All right. We can talk about that. That's an appropriation world. That's not a energy and commerce a world, but it is. I think that a Republican-controlled Congress wants to see a return on investment. We want to see an NIH that's working, and that the money that we give. Remember, it was Newt Gingrich who doubled funding for NIH back in 1995. So we're all in to the science, but the budget pressures cause challenges. Is it legislation? Oh, I asked that one. Senator Durbin proposed the American, I guess this says Cures Act. Almost said Curses Act. So Cures Act. Is this initiative different from Durbin's proposal? I have no idea what Senator Durbin's done. And how can there be complaints about the slowness of the drug approval process when the New England Journal of Medicine article this must be from a reporter, article in the 2012 said the U.S. system is faster than the systems in Europe and Canada? And I guess I would pose that to anyone who wants to comment about. I would just say this. The interest in this table here and the patient groups, the pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare professionals understand that our system is not working the way it should. And the 21st Century Cures is trying to streamline the process, get a better return on investment, and speed the approval of safe drugs to the many cases and stories that you've heard today who kind of feel like they're left out of the process. And if they're left out because of the bureaucratic slowness or not talking to each other, then shame on us. Anybody else want to add?
I want to address something with Mr. Olson's question. The end game, I think, of the 21st Century Cures Initiative is I think what we've seen here today. We have so many people around this table that represent such a wide variety of outcomes within our medical system today. We have those who have seen the lowest of the lows, and those who have seen successes, and those who are still looking for successes, and those who are trying to get to successes. And just sitting around a table like this and putting everybody together to talk about how do we make our policies in Washington better? How do we make our system of trials better? How do we make our approval system even better? Even though you may quote the New England Journal of Medicine, who did a study saying that we are better than Canada and Europe. Well, I want to be the best. I want America to not only be a little bit better, I want America to be the best, the most effective, so that we don't have as many heartbreaking stories as we see around this table. And I think that the message that this shows all of us in Washington as policymakers, it's time to cut through the bureaucracy. Healthcare isn't about websites. It's not about trials. It's not about policies that say, let's see how many we can get into a trial and let's see how many we can. It's personal. As I told you, look, my wife's a cancer survivor. I didn't know until 9 years later that she tested positive for 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 markers for Lynch syndrome. And it's less about my wife's fight in the future against colon cancer because technology's been even easier to even diagnose it. But it's more about my kids. And what kind of effect is it going to have on my kids? And what kind of effect is it going to have on my grandkids? And that's exactly why I'm so proud of John and what he's doing to help lead this charge. Because what we've done here today isn't just a dog and pony show. There's actually going to be taken back, there's going to be action. And we need your help in identifying. And I think what I've learned the most today is how to identify, how do we act? How do we as policymakers make those changes? And I guess, I don't know how much time we have, but I would throw out to the group today is, okay, great. Nobody's going to disagree with any of the recommendations here today. But
No,
when
they
we-
disagree with mine.
but when we go in front of our colleagues, many of you have already been involved in the healthcare policy field more than I have since I'm brand new. But what pushback are we going to have implementing some of these new policies, and how can we effectively continue to be an advocate for the innovative approaches that you put into place, that you've helped put into place? And what pushback did you run into when you tried to move that proposal forward? And how can we continue to be advocates for what we hear today? So thank you, and I'm going to use that as my closing too. So.
Okay, good. Anyone want to weigh in on Rodney's challenge or request? But I think it's a good idea. You all have been involved in the public policy arena in healthcare for a long time. You know where you've stumbled and you've had walls in front of you, and the question is identifying the stumbling blocks, whether it's in, again, the return on investment, the economic principles, or the healthcare educational system, and how do we, I mean, there's a, I've been drugged kicking and screaming into the healthcare policy debate over my career, and a lot of folks who are in the audience know that. One, because it's a caring profession. Everyone here they care for a better outcome for people. I mean, whether it's a nurse anesthetist or a internist or a specialist or the hospital. Having said that, it's the most frustrating place in the world when you're trying to find the dollars and robbing Peter to pay Paul and the whole healthcare financing world, which is just challenging. And the fact that the federal government is a major payer and we don't pay the cost causes cost shifting and cost. So that's why it's been very frustrating. But of course, if we can move forward on this 21st Century Cures initiative, I think we can make strides to do that. We started on time. We're going to end on time. We do appreciate you coming. I know there's probably people here who want to talk to us, want to talk to you all. With that, Chris, do I have anything else I need to do? So I'd like to, again, thank the School of Medicine here for your great hospitality. Again, this transcript will go back to Washington with us to the Health Subcommittee, and I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. So thank you for being here.